Hello again. Someone suggested recently that I might like to do a video about Nelson Mandela, and here it is. I was present during a school assembly at about Christmas time in December 1913 when the headmaster told the children, these were all children under the age of 11, that he was going to talk to them about one of the greatest men that had ever been born in the world, a man who taught us all about forgiveness. Foolishly, I assumed that he was talking about Jesus, it being Christmas and all, but of course he was really talking about Nelson Mandela, who had recently died that month. I've never had much use for saints, even secular saints, and I want to talk a little bit about this man who is still venerated as being something rather like Francis of Assisi, in his patience and gentleness, man of peace. I mean, when you see the photographs of Nelson Mandela after he was released from prison, with those twinkly eyes and the cheery smile, you'd only need to add a white beard and a red hood, and he'd be a dead ringer for Father Christmas, wouldn't he? Nelson Mandela was, despite all the denials made by his supporters and by the ANC, a member of the Communist Party in the 1950s and 1960s, the Moscow-backed Communist Party of South Africa. He was committed to its ideology, but not only that, he was also committed to the armed struggle. And together with Walter Sisulu and Joe Slovo, he founded a terrorist group called Umkhonto we Sizwe, which is the spear of the nation. It's sometimes described as a fighting arm of the ANC, the African National Congress, but actually Umkhonto was founded alongside the South African Communist Party. It was a communist organisation, really. The idea that was that by planting bombs and carrying out terrorist attacks, it would be possible to start a civil war in South Africa, a civil war along racial lines, black against white. In those days, Nelson Mandela, and we're talking now in the late 1950s, early 1960s, Mandela wasn't the dignified, gentle figure that we seem to remember him as now. He doesn't look much like a favourite uncle here, does he? Perhaps this is because he's recently returned from a 6-month tour of Africa, in which he was trying to obtain money and arms with which he was intending to start a war. In Morocco, he spent weeks on a range practicing rifle shooting and learning how to use explosives. We might remember that for the first 50 years of its existence, the African National Congress, the ANC, as it's known for short, was dedicated to non-violent action, to peaceful protest, to taking actions without any violence at all. They were actually actively opposed to violence to achieve their aims. It was Nelson Mandela who abandoned that course and founded Umkhonto we Sizwe. So he was the one that set upon the course of violence for the ANC. I mean, let's be clear, I don't blame Mandela for this at all. After the Sharpeville massacre, I would probably have felt exactly the same if I'd been a black African. I mean, what else were they to do? But that doesn't mean to say that we've got to turn him into a figure like Gandhi at this late stage. We don't have to pretend that he was a proponent of forgiveness and non-violence. He was nothing of the sort, at least until he was an old man, he wasn't. At that age, when he was in that photograph we saw, he was dedicated to setting off bombs and overthrowing the government by armed force. The night before Mandela was arrested in August 1962, he was seen at a party wearing camouflage fatigues and carrying a pistol in a holster at his hip. Again, it hardly fits in with the image we now have of the man. In 1963, Nelson Mandela pleaded guilty to planting bombs and was sentenced to life imprisonment. The organisation, which he had founded, Umkhonto we Sizwe, was now commanded by Joe Slovo. We going to touch upon quite an interesting point now, which has been forgotten today following Mandela's beatification. Umkhonto we Sizwe was a joint enterprise. It wasn't simply the ANC's organisation, not just the armed wing of the ANC. It was a joint enterprise when it was set up between the ANC and the South African Communist Party. And the commander-in-chief for the next 30 years was a white man, dedicated hardline pro-Soviet communist from Lithuania. Here's Joe Slovo. The idea of a white European commanding an African nationalist guerrilla force might raise a few eyebrows, and it certainly needs some explanation. And the explanation lies in geopolitics. During the 1960s and 70s, America and the Soviet Union were jostling for world domination. A lot of that was done by seizing key places. The Americans used to try and seize areas in Southeast Asia or Africa, for example. The Soviets were at the same game. That's why they promoted Castro in the late 50s, because they wanted a pro-Soviet regime close to the American mainland. Some of these areas are crucial from a geopolitical viewpoint because they are on main sea lanes. For example, the Soviet Baltic fleet was bottled up in the Baltic. The only way it could reach the high seas was by passing between Sweden and Denmark. It's a very narrow strait there called the Kattegat, which in Swedish is the cat flap, the cat door. And that meant that that was a vital area for NATO to control. It's the same thing with the Soviet Black Fleet. They are bottled up. They can't reach the Mediterranean and the high seas without passing through the Bosphorus, where Istanbul is, and also the Dardanelles, which some of you probably have heard of from the First World War. So there was a struggle there. The Soviets very much wanted Turkey to be in their sphere of influence. I worked in Turkey for some while in the late 1970s, and there was practically a state of civil war then. Pro-Soviet groups, communist groups, were fighting pitched gun battles in the streets with right-wing groups. That ended with the coup of 1980. But the whole aim there was so that the Soviets could install a regime in Istanbul and Ankara that would be sympathetic to them, because of the fact that those choke points there, the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles, were in Turkey. Exactly the same game was being played around South Africa. Much of the world's oil tankers passes from the Gulf to the rest of the world around the Cape, actually past South Africa. And there's, there used to be a very important naval base there called Simonstown. If the Soviets could have had control of South Africa, it would have been very useful for them. They would have been able, if they wanted, to cut off the supply of oil to a lot of the world. And that's what lay behind the campaign to free Nelson Mandela in the 1980s. The Soviet Union thought that if the South African regime could be toppled, then their people, people like Joe Slovo and Nelson Mandela, could be installed as leaders, and that would give the Soviets control of a very important strategic part of Africa. And that's the reason that Umkhonto we Sizwe continued to carry out bombings and terrorist acts for all those years, for 30 years. It was because that they were following the Soviet line and aiding the Soviet Union in their long-term strategy. Although in prison, Mandela still exercised control over these people. These are guerrilla fighters of Umkhonto we Sizwe, and they're based in neighbouring country Angola, which the Soviet Union did manage to seize control of in 1976. Their aim, as I say, the Soviet aim, was really simple. They were trying to install a new colonial regime. They thought that Joe Slovo, who was one of them, might end up even heading a new government in South Africa if they could just get rid of the Boers there. And that was the whole purpose. It was part of their grand plan for world domination. It came to nothing, obviously, with the collapse of the Soviet Union in the late 80s and the early 1990s, the fall of the Warsaw Pact countries. But it might be worth remembering the next time you have a vision of this cheerful old man, you might just remember that it was these people, with weapons paid for by Moscow, who provided his power.